The day the HOA called my forest home ugly was the day they accidentally started a legal battle they were never prepared to fight. I didn't live in a mansion. I didn't have polished stone columns or perfectly trimmed decorative hedges. What I had was wood, stone, and history. My house stood at the edge of Pine Hollow Forest, built from reclaimed timber and local rock. It blended into the trees instead of fighting them. Moss grew gently along the north wall. Wind moved freely through the tall pines surrounding it. To me, it wasn't ugly. It was alive. But apparently, that was the problem. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, taped flat against my wooden front door. Notice of aesthetic violation. I actually laughed when I first read it. Until I reached the sentence that changed everything. Structure deemed visually inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Mandatory exterior modification required within 30 days. Visually inconsistent. That was their polite way of saying they hated it. 3 years earlier, when I bought this land, there were no homes anywhere near it. Just forest. My property lines stretched deep into the trees. I had checked zoning laws, permits, environmental impact rules. Everything was legal. Then development came. A new gated community slowly formed beyond the southern ridge. Identical beige houses. Identical black roofs. Identical driveways. And eventually, an HOA. I wasn't part of it. I had never signed anything. So when I called the number listed on the letter, I expected confusion. Instead, I got confidence. You are within the Pine Hollow Residential Visual Corridor, the HOA president said calmly. Your home impacts overall property value. I stood on my porch, staring at miles of untouched trees. My nearest neighbor is half a mile away, I replied. Visibility extends beyond distance, she said. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about paint color. It wasn't about property value. It was about control. Later that evening, a drone flew over my roof. It hovered there for several seconds before drifting back toward the new development. They weren't just complaining. They were documenting. And that was the moment I decided to pull something out of my safe, something older than their entire subdivision. The original land deed. The original land deed wasn't framed. It wasn't decorative. It was folded carefully inside a fireproof envelope at the back of my safe, alongside tax records and old survey maps. When I laid it across my kitchen table that night, the paper felt heavier than it looked. Dated 1953. Signed by the county clerk. Stamped with an official seal that had long since faded into a muted shade of blue. But the most important detail wasn't the age. It was the wording. The parcel description clearly defined my property as independent woodland, exempt from future subdivision association governance unless voluntarily annexed by written consent of the owner. Voluntarily annexed. I had never signed anything. I had never attended a Pine Hollow HOA meeting. I had never agreed to architectural standards. Yet they had sent me a violation notice as if I were one of their beige, copy-paste houses. The next morning, I drove down the winding road toward the development for the first time since construction began. Perfect sidewalks. Fresh asphalt. Identical mailboxes. Every lawn trimmed to the exact same height. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a catalog. The clubhouse sat at the entrance, white pillars, artificial stone facade, and a large metal sign reading Pine Hollow Estates. Estates. The irony wasn't lost on me. Inside, the receptionist didn't recognize my address at first. That property backs into the restricted visual corridor, she said after typing for a moment. You were added during the expansion phase. Added? I repeated. Yes. All properties within view of the main development fall under aesthetic compliance. Even if we never joined. She offered a tight smile. It protects community value. There it was again. Value. Not rights. Not consent. Value. I placed a copy of the deed on the counter. I think you'll want to show this to your president, I said calmly. She skimmed it quickly, and for the first time, her professional expression shifted. A pause. A frown. That exemption clause, she murmured. Yes, I replied. That one. She disappeared into a back office. Through the glass door, I could see animated discussion. Pointing. A phone lifted. More papers pulled from a filing cabinet. When she returned, her tone had changed. We'll need time to review this. Take all the time you need, I said. But stop flying drones over my roof. Her eyes widened slightly. So they hadn't expected me to notice. As I walked back outside into the uniform quiet of Pine Hollow Estates, I realized something important. They hadn't assumed I would fight. They had assumed I would comply. And they were about to learn the difference. 3 days later, I received another letter. This one wasn't taped to my door. It arrived certified mail. Formal review hearing scheduled. They weren't backing down. They were escalating. The hearing would take place at the Pine Hollow Clubhouse the following Thursday at 7 p.m. Attendance strongly encouraged. Encouraged. I knew what that meant. They expected me to show up alone, defensive, maybe flustered, a lone homeowner standing against a polished board of directors armed with bylaws and rehearsed language. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 evenings reading every publicly available county zoning record tied to Pine Hollow Estates. And I had found something interesting. The development's expansion phase, the one that allegedly placed my property within their visual corridor, had been approved conditionally. Conditionally. Specifically, it stated that no existing exempt woodland parcels could be forcibly annexed without documented owner consent. Documented. Signed. Filed. There was no gray area. Thursday evening arrived cold and quiet. The clubhouse parking lot was half full. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where 5 HOA board members sat with identical folders stacked neatly in front of them. The president, a woman in her early 50s with sharp posture and sharper eyes, nodded when I entered. "Thank you for coming," she said smoothly. "I'm always happy to discuss property rights," I replied. A few residents in the audience shifted uncomfortably. The president began with slides. Photos of my home taken from a distance. Drone footage. Zoomed angles through the trees. "This structure disrupts uniform aesthetic cohesion," she explained. "It negatively affects market perception." Market perception. I stood when she finished. "Before we continue," I said calmly, placing a folder on the table, "I'd like the board to review Section 4B of your expansion approval." There was a flicker of confusion. One of the board members flipped through papers quickly. The president's jaw tightened. "You're referring to county conditional language," she said. "Yes," I replied. "The part that prevents forced annexation of exempt woodland parcels." Silence stretched across the room. Several residents began whispering. "You were never legally granted jurisdiction over my property," I continued. "And any attempt to impose compliance standards constitutes overreach." The word hung in the air. Overreach. The president leaned forward slightly. "Our council interprets the visual corridor clause differently." "Then your council should read it again," I said evenly. The room wasn't tense anymore. It was shifting. Because suddenly, this wasn't about whether my house was ugly. It was about whether they had authority at all. And that question made even the board members look uncertain. The silence in the clubhouse wasn't dramatic. It was uncomfortable. There's a difference. Dramatic silence feels staged. Uncomfortable silence feels real. The board members weren't whispering now. They were reading. Actually reading. The president kept her composure, but I could see the subtle shift. Her shoulders stiffened, her pen stopped moving, And for the first time that evening, she wasn't speaking. One of the quieter board members cleared his throat. This conditional approval, he began cautiously, does state that woodland parcels existing prior to subdivision formation remain independent unless formally annexed. Correct, I said calmly. An annexation requires written owner consent. Also correct. The president interjected quickly. The visual corridor designation was meant to protect overall property values. Protection, I replied, does not equal jurisdiction. A few residents in the audience nodded. This was the moment they hadn't planned for. Not a shouting match. Not emotional defiance. Just documentation. The president shifted strategies. Even if your parcel is technically exempt, she said smoothly, your home is still visible from our Southern Ridge walking trail. We have the right to maintain community standards within sight lines. I opened another folder. County GIS maps. Elevation surveys. Tree density reports. Your Southern Ridge Trail is 0.62 miles from my primary structure, I said. And visibility is obstructed by natural tree growth exceeding 60% canopy density. One board member actually leaned back. The president didn't. Are you suggesting, she said carefully, that our development plan was improperly expanded? I'm suggesting, I replied, that someone assumed exemption clauses wouldn't be challenged. The air shifted again. This wasn't about paint colors. It wasn't about wood siding. It was about liability. If the HOA had overstepped its authority even slightly, every fine, every compliance order, every enforcement action tied to that expansion phase could be questioned. That realization moved through the room like a ripple. A resident in the third row raised her hand. If that clause was ignored, she asked slowly, does that mean the HOA doesn't actually control everything we were told it does? The president's jaw tightened again. This hearing concerns a single property, she said firmly. But it didn't anymore. Because once people see cracks in authority, they start looking for more. I gathered my papers calmly. I'm not asking for special treatment, I said. I'm asking you to respect the boundaries written into law long before Pine Hollow Estates existed. No one clapped. No one argued. They were thinking. And thinking is far more dangerous to unchecked power than shouting ever is. The president finally spoke. We will adjourn to review this matter with counsel. Which was her way of saying, this isn't going the way we expected. As I walked out into the cold night air, I realized something important. They had tried to call my home ugly. But now they were worried something else might be exposed. 2 days after the hearing, Pine Hollow Estates went quiet. No new letters. No follow-up emails. No drone hovering above my roof. Silence again, but this time, it felt strategic. I knew they were consulting attorneys. I also knew something else. When organizations pause instead of pushing, it usually means they've found something inconvenient. On Saturday morning, I received an email from a Pine Hollow resident I'd never met. Subject line, is this what you meant? Attached was a PDF copy of the subdivision's original master filing. Not the polished HOA handbook they handed new homeowners. The actual county-recorded development plan. I opened it slowly. And there it was. Buried in Appendix C. A paragraph referencing the expansion phase and explicitly acknowledging adjacent exempt woodland parcels not subject to architectural conformity. It wasn't vague. It wasn't flexible. It was clear. Even more interesting, the appendix included a highlighted note from the developer's legal team stating, visual continuity does not constitute regulatory authority over pre-existing independent tracts. Regulatory authority. In other words, just because they could see my house didn't mean they controlled it. I leaned back in my chair. So this wasn't an oversight. It had been known. The HOA board had inherited a development that came with limits, and somewhere along the line, they decided those limits were inconvenient. Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled slowly up my gravel drive. Not a drone. Not a letter. An in-person visit. The HOA president stepped out, alone this time. No clipboard. No rehearsed tone. "May we speak?" she asked. I didn't invite her inside. We stood on the porch, the forest quiet behind us. "Our counsel has reviewed the documentation," she began carefully. "There appears to be ambiguity." "There isn't," I replied evenly. "There's language you don't like." Her lips pressed thin. "The expansion filing could expose the association if interpreted broadly." "And who interpreted it narrowly?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she tried another angle. "If we formally withdraw the violation notice," she said, "would you be willing to maintain a cooperative relationship with the association?" Cooperative. That word again. Not compliant. Not controlled. Cooperative. "You attempted to impose authority where none existed," I said. "That's not cooperation." Her gaze drifted toward the tree line. "You understand," she said quietly, "that if this clause becomes widely discussed, other enforcement matters could be questioned." There it was. The real fear. Not my house. Precedent. Because if one homeowner challenged jurisdiction successfully, others might start reading their documents too. I folded my arms. "You called my home ugly," I said calmly. "But what you're really afraid of is exposure." She didn't deny it. And that told me everything. The president left my porch without another word. But something had already shifted. By Monday morning, Pine Hollow's private community forum was active in a way it had never been before. Not complaints about lawn height. Not reminders about trash bins. Questions. Has anyone seen Appendix C? Were we told about exemption clauses? What exactly is the Visual Corridor Authority? The clause had escaped containment. And I hadn't posted a single word. Residents had started digging on their own. That's the thing about controlled communities, they function smoothly as long as no one looks too closely at the foundation. But once someone shines a light on a structural limit, people begin checking their own walls. By Wednesday evening, I received 3 direct messages. One homeowner had been fined for installing solar panels outside of approved roof aesthetics. Another had paid thousands to replace a fence the HOA claimed disrupted uniform sight lines. A third asked a simple question. If they overstepped with you, could they have overstepped with us? I didn't offer legal advice. I simply shared the publicly filed county documents. Facts. Language. Signatures. The president sent a formal announcement that night. Pine Hollow Estates remains fully compliant with all county approvals. Misinterpretations of conditional language should not cause unnecessary concern. Misinterpretations. Interesting choice of word. The next HOA meeting was packed. Standing room only. I sat quietly in the back. This wasn't my fight anymore. It belonged to the residents. The board attempted to steer the agenda toward routine matters, landscaping budgets, pool maintenance schedules, but the room wouldn't move on. A man in the front row stood up. "Why weren't we informed about limitations within the expansion approval?" he asked. The president maintained her composure. "All legal documents were filed appropriately." "That's not what I asked," he replied. Another homeowner spoke. "If enforcement authority was narrower than presented, do we have grounds for reimbursement?" The word reimbursement made the treasurer visibly pale. Because now the conversation wasn't theoretical. It was financial. The board called for order, but momentum had taken hold. Residents weren't shouting. They were asking. Calmly. Precisely. And that made it harder to dismiss. At one point, the president's eyes met mine across the room. Not angry. Not hostile. Measured. She understood what had happened. Calling my home ugly had forced documentation into the open. And documentation doesn't disappear once read. The meeting adjourned without resolution. But as people filtered out, something was clear. The authority Pine Hollow projected so confidently a month ago no longer felt absolute. It felt conditional. And conditional authority is far more fragile than it appears. By the end of the week, Pine Hollow Estates had hired an external legal consultant. That announcement alone told everyone what they needed to know. When organizations bring in outside review, it's rarely to confirm strength. It's to measure damage. The community forum was no longer cautious. It was investigative. Residents began sharing copies of past violation letters, compliance notices, and fine schedules. Patterns started forming. Solar panels. Fence heights. Exterior paint tones labeled earth-adjacent neutrals. Even a family that had been required to remove a small greenhouse because it disrupted visual flow from ridge elevation. Visual flow. That phrase now sounded different. Because if the HOA's jurisdiction over my property had been limited by conditional expansion language, what else had been interpreted broadly? 2 weeks later, a formal audit was announced. Not of finances. Of authority. The consultant would review enforcement history dating back to the expansion phase. I didn't attend the closed session, but word traveled quickly. The expansion clause had indeed restricted regulatory authority over adjacent exempt parcels. More concerning, internal board memos from years prior acknowledged the limitation and recommended uniform enforcement presentation to prevent fragmentation. Uniform enforcement presentation. In other words, maintain the appearance of control. Even where legal control was narrower. When the summary findings were presented at the next open meeting, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one where my home had been projected on a screen and labeled inconsistent. There was no slideshow this time. Just a statement. Pine Hollow Estates recognizes that certain enforcement actions may have extended beyond the intended scope of the expansion approval. The board is committed to correcting procedural inconsistencies. Procedural inconsistencies. Another careful phrase. But residents understood what it meant. Overreach. Refund discussions began immediately. Not everyone was affected, but enough were. The solar panel fines were rescinded. The greenhouse removal was acknowledged as improperly compelled. And my violation notice? Officially withdrawn. No aesthetic modification required. No compliance deadline. No corridor jurisdiction. The president delivered the announcement without visible emotion. But leadership changes were already being discussed quietly among residents. Authority hadn't just cracked. It had been audited. As the meeting ended, a woman approached me in the parking lot. "You didn't just protect your house," she said. "You protected the rest of us." I hadn't set out to lead anything. I had only refused to be absorbed into something I never agreed to join. But sometimes resistance exposes more than intention. As I drove back toward the forest that night, the identical beige homes faded in my rear-view mirror. My house stood exactly as it had before. Wood. Stone. History. The only difference was this. Now, everyone understood its boundaries. The audit didn't end the tension. It redirected it. For years, Pine Hollow Estates had operated under quiet compliance. Residents paid fines, adjusted fences, repainted shutters not because they always agreed, but because the board appeared unshakable. Now that appearance was gone. 2 weeks after the audit summary, a petition began circulating. Not aggressively. Not angrily. Deliberately. It called for a leadership review vote at the next quarterly meeting. The language was measured. In light of recent findings regarding expansion enforcement interpretation, residents request reassessment of current board leadership. Reassessment. No insults. No accusations. Just accountability. By the time signatures were counted, more than half the homeowners had signed. The president responded with a composed community-wide email. Healthy governance includes transparency and trust. If residents believe new leadership will restore confidence, we will respect the process. It was the most candid statement she had made since this began. The night of the vote, the clubhouse was fuller than I had ever seen it. I didn't sit in the back this time. I didn't sit at the front either. I simply stood along the side wall. The president opened the meeting without slides, without formality. Pine Hollow was built on structure, she began. But structure without trust cannot stand. If enforcement extended beyond its intended scope, that responsibility rests with leadership. There were no boos. No applause. Just attention. Ballots were distributed. Collected. Counted in full view of the room. When the final tally was announced, the result wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. The current president would step down at the end of the quarter. 2 new board members would be elected immediately. The treasurer, who had remained mostly silent throughout the controversy, would oversee the transition. The president nodded once when the result was read. No argument. No delay. She understood something important: authority can survive error, but it rarely survives concealment. As residents began to file out, conversations were calmer than I expected. There was no celebration. Only relief. In the parking lot, someone joked lightly, "Guess we all learned to read the fine print." Laughter followed. But it wasn't mocking. It was collective. As I walked toward my truck, I noticed the president standing alone near her car. For a moment, we made eye contact. She didn't look angry. She looked thoughtful. Calling my forest home ugly had seemed small at the time. Aesthetic. Trivial. But it had forced a community to re-examine its foundation. And foundations matter more than facades ever will. The morning after the vote, the forest felt unchanged. Mist drifted between the pine trunks just as it always had. Wind moved through the branches in a low, steady rhythm. Sunlight filtered down in uneven patches across the stone steps leading to my front door. Nothing about my house had shifted. The wood still carried its natural grain. The moss still traced quiet lines along the north wall. The roof still blended into the canopy instead of standing against it. But something beyond the trees had changed. For weeks, Pine Hollow Estates had debated authority, language, and enforcement. They had audited their own reach. They had voted on leadership. They had refunded fines and rewritten procedural guidelines. And through all of it, my home remained exactly what it had always been: lawful. Not because it was louder. Not because it was more expensive. But because it existed within boundaries written long before anyone poured concrete for the subdivision. Later that afternoon, I received a formal letter. Violation notice, officially rescinded. Below that, another line. Pine Hollow Estates acknowledges the independent status of your parcel and respects its exemption from association governance. Respects. A small word. But this time, it felt accurate. Weeks earlier, they had flown drones over my roof to document what they called inconsistency. Now, the same ridge trail that allegedly suffered from visual disruption offered a quiet view of trees, and somewhere beyond them, a house built from timber and stone. Unchanged. Unaffected. A few days later, one of the newly elected board members stopped by my property line. Not to inspect. Not to question. To introduce himself. "We're drafting clearer disclosure language for new homeowners," he said. "About expansion limits. About what the HOA can and can't regulate." "That's good," I replied. He nodded toward the trees. "For what it's worth," he added, "most of us never thought your place was ugly." I smiled slightly. It was never about beauty. He seemed to understand. Because the forest had never been the problem. Control had been. When communities forget the difference between influence and authority, conflict grows quietly like roots beneath soil. But roots can also hold structures steady.
As evening started over Pine Hollow, the British house beyond the ridge reflected the fending light and inductical angles, and in the forest, my home did what it had always done. It stood not as an act of religion, not as a statement, but as proof that ownership and probably documented and understood doesn't require permission. Sometimes all it requires is being willing to open the safe and read what was written there first.